$4 has been said, 4 tests have been said. You have done that already. I am Adam City Board.
Yeah, that's really cool. Because there weren't too many people left. This is not
All right, everybody, you'll take a seat, please. All right, so everyone, I have the pleasure of a new family member of the Southern campaigns of the American Revolution. I just met him, Damon Fordham. I said that right?
You're saying it right.
And you know, his bio's in there. The point I want to bring out now is the last two speakers, Damon and one more to come, are actually professional historians. And I guess we got to count Steve Smith too, because he's an archaeologist who's paid. So these are the real people who are making a living, actually teaching and helping to bring out the next generation. I always ask what's something different, and in fact I got a real good inside scoop, but I'm not allowed to say a few things that he's very talented, but two of them are that he plays the melodica. He picked it up during the pandemic, which is a really neat little instrument, and maybe we can get him to get it out of the car or something. And he also does a walking tour, which is called the The Lost Stories of Black Charleston. So the Lost Stories of Black Charleston are something we're going to have to get to, and it's amazing. But let me ask the question for basics. So where do we know, as already mentioned earlier today, where some blacks came from to serve in our Southern campaigns? What country? Well, it was said earlier this morning.
What's the question?
What's the country where blacks came from to help serve in that Southern campaign? I can't believe this. We're not paying attention to the speakers. Haiti. Interestingly enough, a Haitian who would then be moved to the northeast and then to the northwest, whose name is, I had to throw up something for you, is Dusable. He will fight with, he's a Haitian, he's only 25 years old. He'll fight with George Rogers Clark in the west and help defeat the British there. And then he is actually, this blew my mind, sorry, you have to educate me. He actually founded the trading post, which is the founding of Chicago.
That's right.
By a Haitian black, which is great. So without further ado, Damon Fordham, let's give him a hip hip.
As a matter of fact, there's also a DuSable High School in Chicago that's named after Jean-Baptiste DuSable. It's the alma mater of Nat King Cole, Red Fox, and many other celebrities from the Chicago region, as well as John Johnson, the founder of Ebony Magazine, which is the magazine as a boy. I learned a lot of these stories, so that's pretty good that you tie that all in. Now, regarding the blacks in the American Revolution. Now, that's a story that I found that's not known even by a lot of people who specialize in this. A couple of years ago, I gave a talk where, I believe it was in Camden, if I'm not mistaken, where I mentioned that the first person to die for the freedom of what we now know as the United States was a man named Crispus Attucks from Barbados. He had run away from slavery in Massachusetts. And what? Hold it. Yep, I know some of you are like, wait, slavery in Massachusetts? Yes, slavery existed in the North until 1827. And how it ended in the North will be at the tail end of what I'm going to talk about. Anyway, Crispus ran away around 1752 or so. He was born in Barbados. And he worked on ships as a free man. And then during the March of 1770, he was a group of friends of his, when some British soldiers arrested an American And the Americans felt that he was being treated unfairly. So they were yelling, "Get out of here, you lobster backs," referring to the redcoats, of course. And they started throwing snowballs with rocks in them at the lobster backs, and the lobster backs picked up their rifles and fired. And it is widely believed that Crispus Attucks was the very first to lose his life that day. And there's a statue in Boston Commons that mentions Crispus Attucks among them. But in spite of that, there was initial reluctance to have black soldiers when the American Revolution came along. Why? For a very simple reason. Many of the men who were among the founding fathers, especially in the Southland, were slave owners. And if you give your slave a gun, who's he going to shoot? All right? So they were like, "Oh no, we're not having that." But a couple of things happened that turned the tide. One is the story of a man by the name of James Lafayette, who I will tell momentarily. But one important thing with all of this was what happened whenever you're at war with an enemy. The thing that the enemy must do is to find your Achilles heel. What is the weakness that we can exploit? So along comes James Murray, who was the Royal Lord Governor of Virginia, 1775, who was known better as Lord Dunmore. So he said, okay, so the Americans don't want black people fighting in their army. I know what I'll do. He declared a proclamation that said, in the language of that time, that all Negroes who were wishing for their freedom could come and join what he called the Ethiopian Regiment, which is an army of Ethiopia. In those days, they used that as a generic term for Africa. And so therefore, they came by the thousands off the plantations to join up with the British. So they met against the Americans with the Battle of Kemp's Landing in Virginia. And they were fighting Colonel Joseph Hutchins on the American side. And this was the scene, an approximation of what happened shortly afterwards. General Washington. Yes, come in, what is it? General Washington, I have terrible tidings for you. Oh, really? What is it? General, we have lost the Battle of Kemp's Landing. What? Oh my goodness, that's terrible. General Washington, it's even worse than that. How could it be worse? General, we have lost to a regiment of Negroes. What? Oh my goodness. Not only that, do you know who they kept? Do you know what else happened? No, what else happened? General Colonel Hutchins was captured. He was? Yes, by one of his own slaves. Oh! Oh, this is terrible. It's terrible. General, the worst is yet to come. How could it be any worse? General, guess who joined up with this Ethiopian regiment? Who? Some of your own slaves from Mount Vernon. Oh! That, ladies and gentlemen, is what led to the recruiting of black patriots during the American Revolution. One such man was William Billy Lee, who in fact was owned by George Washington. And he assisted General Washington in numerous battles during the American Revolution. And I'm sure that some of you heard the story about how General Washington freed his enslaved people upon his death, right? Well, see, William Billy Lee was the first that he officially named as such to be freed immediately upon his death. The others were owned by Martha, who would be freed upon her death. Okay? So while all this is going on, you also had James Lafayette. James Lafayette was part of the Battle of Bunker Hill, as a matter of fact. And he would also go on to spy against Benedict Arnold, among other things, and would serve in various loyalist camps pretending to be this illiterate enslaved person and taking messages back to the Patriots. And he became friendly with the Marquis de Lafayette. And he was basically his right-hand man as Lafayette was assisting us during the American Revolution. So much so that because of Lafayette's service, after the war, he petitioned the Virginia legislature for his freedom, and in 1787, he was among those who received his freedom. And many years later, when Lafayette toured America, James Lafayette was milling around as this was happening, and so the Marquis de Lafayette stopped the parade for him and insisted that he go out and greet James Lafayette for his service. So James Lafayette was the first African-American soldier to be honored, to be greatly honored for his service, and was one of those who was freed for his service in the American Revolution. Now, I told you about this Ethiopian regiment, right? Well, one such person was Colonel Tai, and the colonel was just an honorary title for him. He went around, he was a loyalist who went on sharpshooting missions for the British, fighting largely in New Jersey until he was shot in the leg and died of gangrene early in the war. But one really interesting person in all this was a man named Boston King. Boston King was born in what we would now call Somerville, South Carolina. And he was also the first black South Carolinian to write his autobiography in 1798. And he tells of how badly mistreated he was during slavery until he ran away to Charleston. And he wound up in Charleston in 1780. And guess what was happening in Charleston in 1780? British occupation. So he decided to cast his lot with the British, figuring that that would give him his freedom. And it turned out that he did. He learned to read and write and became a minister. But then, Houston, we had a little problem here. You see, the Lord Dunmore promised all black men who fought for the Loyalist cause that they would get their freedom when the British won the war. The British didn't win the war. However, they made arrangements for a lot of these men to go in a place called Birchtown, up in Nova Scotia and several other cities in that region. However, they had another problem. Rumors spread among the whites up there that these black people would come there and work cheap and take their jobs. Sound kind of familiar, doesn't it? And so, therefore, that wasn't working out. So people like Boston King demanded of King George, Your Majesty, we have fought, bled, and died for the crown of England, and yet we're treated as if we were still slaves who did nothing for the empire. Can you not do better than this by these people? So King George said, well, I see what I can do here. We have some land down in Sierra Leone in West Africa, so that you can go back there and live in freedom. So it is written, so it is done, Lord save the king, and so forth. So they set up a colony down in Sierra Leone for these newly freed people who had fought for the British Army, and so since Sierra Leone was a British colony, a lot of them literally went back to Africa, and Boston King became a minister and missionary before he died in the early 1800s. And before he died, he wrote his autobiography in 1798, where he detailed these experiences. Now, some other people who are worthy of mentioning this, let's take this down on a South Carolina level. Now, I was born in Spartanburg, and one story I've always found interesting was the story of Colin. Who's Colin, you may ask? Well, now, up near Spartanburg, you have what's known as the Battle of Cowpens, okay? Fought by the Spartan Guards, who, of course, that's how the town of Spartanburg got its name. And Colin was an interesting person. He was born in about 1767, and he worked as a servant for Lieutenant Colonel William Washington of the 3rd Continental Light Dragoons. And so during the Battle of Cowpens, January 17th, 1781, there was an interesting incident that happened. You see, it mentioned that Lieutenant Colonel Washington had given orders to his men not to fire a pistol. So they got in pursuit of the British cavalry, and he got ahead of his men perhaps by 30 yards. And 3 of the British officers observed this, and they wheeled around and made a charge at Lieutenant Colonel William Washington. So the officer on his right hand was raising his arm to actually stab to stab Colonel Washington with his knife. However, Colin just happened to have a pistol on him, and he pulled out his pistol and shot the British man, saving William Washington's life at the Battle of Cowpens in 1791. Very little known fact about American history, and that was chronicled by one of your own, a gentleman by the name of Michael Scroggins, who some of you might remember, who did a lot of writing about the American Revolution. Now, there was, of course, also, since we're here talking largely about Francis Marion, I can, of course, not mention the story of Oscar. Oscar Marion, who was owned by General Francis Marion, who had fought along his side at the siege of Savannah, as well as the siege of the Charleston, as well as the Battle of Eutaw Springs. What is little known about Oscar was that not only the tragic fact that he was never freed in spite of his efforts as far as we know, but a living cousin of his went to President George W. Bush with the story and managed to get a Medal of Honor recognition by President George W. Bush in 2006 to commemorate his heroism and sacrifice. Another such soldier was Peter Salem of Massachusetts, who served at the Battle of Bunker Hill after he was freed to serve with the militia. And a marker exists for him in Farmington, Massachusetts, that was built in 1882. Now, along with all of these interesting things, I have to mention the important role that a couple of women played in all of this. Now, I just mentioned earlier that Boston King was the first African American to write his autobiography. Well, the first he was actually the first African American man that we know of who wrote like that. The first African American woman to have her work published as a book was a lady by the name of Phyllis Wheatley. And Phyllis Wheatley, for those of you who don't know, she was born in Africa in around 1753. Around the age of 7, she was captured on the West Coast, but instead of going south, the ship went to Massachusetts, where she was owned by a family named Wheatley. And the Wheatleys, she was not one of these plantation slaves picking cotton in the hot fields or anything like that. She was basically a house servant, as many in the North were in those days. And the Wheatleys taught her how to read, not just English, but also Latin. And she became quite fond of the classics and began to write and publish poetry. And so she wrote her first book of poetry around 1770 or so, but the times were such that she had to get sworn affidavits by prominent white men in her community that this was no hoax, that she really wrote this book herself. Now, it's important that I mention that literacy, even among white Americans, was rare in those days. So it was doubly rare for African Americans at that time, because, of course, if you teach a man or a woman to read and write, they will know that there is more to their lives than enslavement, as Frederick Douglass would greatly demonstrate in the next century. So anyway, she was very much caught up in the patriot cause. And she was moved by George Washington's heroics early in the war. So in 1775, she wrote a letter to George Washington that says as follows: "Dear Sir, I have taken the freedom to address your excellency in the enclosed poem and entreat your acceptance, though I am not insensible to its inaccuracies. Your being appointed the Grand Continental Congress to be Generalissimo of the armies of North America, together with the fame of your virtues, excites sensations not easy to suppress. Your generosity, therefore, I presume, will pardon the attempt. Wishing your excellency all possible success in the great cause you are so generously engaged in, I am sincerely yours, Phyllis Wheatley." And I'll just give you a couple of verses of this. "Celestial choir enthroned in realms of light, Columbia's scenes of glorious toils I write, while freedom's cause her anxious breast alarms. She flashes dreadful in refulgent arms. See Mother Earth, her offspring's fate bemoan, and nations gaze at seas before unknown. See the bright beams of heaven's revolving light, involved in sorrows in the veil of night. And goes on to say, proceed, deep great chief, with virtue on thy side. Thy every action let the goddess guide, a crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine, with gold unfading, Washington be thine. Well, George Washington liked the poem. And he wrote her back saying that he would have publicized it, otherwise it would have been immodest. He felt it would have been immodest if he publicized it. But he said that he was greatly honored to hear from someone who has been so greatly gifted by the muses. That was his word. And he invited her, and he actually invited her on a courtesy call to Mount Vernon. And he did. Okay? So that would make Phyllis Wheatley the very first person of African descent to meet with the head of state of what would become the United States, as well as being the first African-American poet to publish her own book. And another little-known person who played an important role of all this, who was inspired by the revolution, was a lady who went by the name of Mom Bet. And here's her story. Now, I can tell by the looks of this audience that many of you are not familiar with that, and I'm not surprised, but that's okay. And I'll tell you why that's okay a little later on. But Mom Bet was in slavery around Massachusetts. Around 1773, she would hear the street orators while she was in slavery. And while she was in slavery, there was one particular incident where her madam was about to strike her sister with an iron, and instead of sitting back and watching this, she intervened and tried to stop it, and the blow left a terrible scar on her arm. And whenever people would say, how'd you get that scar? She would go, ask madam, to show you that she was nobody to play with. Well, anyway, she would go down the streets and she would hear the orators speaking of freedom from England and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and all men are created equal with inalienable rights, etc. and so forth, and the consent of the governed, etc. and so forth. And she started thinking, wait a minute, hold up, something's wrong with this picture. So she went to a lawyer named Sedgwick in Massachusetts and said, now, Mr. Sedgwick, I have to ask you a question. Now, I hear all these people talking about freedom and independence and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and all men are created equal, and governments running by the consent of the government, and so forth. Does that or does that not apply to me? Well, the lawyer Sedgwick said, no, you might have a case here. So they went to court, and she sued for her freedom. And the judge ruled that there was nothing in the Declaration of Independence that had an asterisk to say that it did not apply to her because she was black and because she was a woman. So therefore, she was declared free by the state of Massachusetts. And she announced that from then on, she would no longer be Mom Bet, she would be known as Elizabeth Freeman, to reflect her new status. And not only that, that act would go on to end slavery in the state of Massachusetts. And state after state in New England and the North would end slavery until New York in 1827. And that was relatively easy for the simple fact that you did not have the plantation system in the North that you did in the South. Many of these people were basically house servants, as enslaved people and so forth. So therefore, there was not a great financial loss. But that act by Mom Bet, or Elizabeth Freeman, led to the freedom of her people in the northern states. Needless to say, as we all know, in the South, that would be a whole lot more difficult over the next century or so. So all of this goes to show that whether you were dealing with the Patriots or the Loyalists within the black community of America at that time, they were basically all fighting for the same thing, that the American troops, no matter what race, were fighting for, and that was for their freedom and of their independence. And another thing that I hope that this story gets across to this audience today is the following idea, something that I tell to my students all the time, and that is this. The more you learn, there is to learn. Thank you. Yeah, I'll take questions. Yes, sir.
Hold on here.
Okay.
I interviewed a gentleman for History Man podcast. I interviewed a gentleman out of Beaufort, North Carolina, and he's tied with the Tryon Palace out there as one of the historians. And he was talking about a group of pioneer black families that had come over on the original ships and had made their way down just south of Beaufort, North Carolina, and established a pioneer community. And they volunteered into the Continental Army out of North Carolina. Do you have any idea how many pioneer black families were involved with the Revolutionary War, especially on the Patriot side?
Okay, that's a story that even within Michael Scoggins' book, basically he had to deal with a whole lot of scraps from material with that, because a lot of these things just simply weren't written down at that time. So those of us who are in the historical field, we're kind of finding new things about that every day. Now, it just goes back to what I just said a few minutes ago about the more you learn, there is to learn. I've never heard that story before. You said that just now, so I just learned something today. By the way, I'd like to talk to you about that podcast in a little while, okay?
Love to have you on.
Okay.
Damon, as we go to another question, tell how people can get a hold of you. I forgot to mention your YouTube and your tours.
Right, I do a YouTube channel. I have a YouTube channel. It's called The American Storyteller, okay? You can easily find it on YouTube. As a matter of fact, this address will be uploaded to that either late tonight or early tomorrow, whenever I get home or get up. And along with that, I've written 4 books. The most recent one is called The 1895 Segregation Fight in South Carolina, which you can find on the History Press and many of your Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, and even your CVS drugstores. And the others can be found in libraries. And I'm currently working on an anthology of black folklore and narratives of South Carolina, which I'll finish the manuscript in December, and it should be out next year. It's going to conclude some stories that I got from the storytellers and folklore. As a matter of fact, there's a lady in this audience, Miss Irene Lumcheon. She and I were in Africa over the summer, and I managed to meet some of the interesting storytellers over there from that and another visit. Some of that material is going to be included as a prelude to the South Carolina stories.
Quick one, sir.
Yes.
You mentioned Miss Elizabeth Freeman.
Yes.
My ears are bad. What was her first name? Mom Bet?
Well, she was originally known as Mom Bet when she was enslaved, and so once she became free, she decided to Christian herself with a new name of Dignity. So, can you hear me all right?
I heard you now. I just couldn't get the Ma Bet.
Oh, no worries, no worries. But anyway, for those who didn't get that clearly, while she was enslaved, she was known as Mom Bet. But she wanted to, after she was freed, she wanted to use a new name of Dignity. And so thus she became Elizabeth Freeman to reflect her new status.
Thank you.
I have a quick question over here.
Yes.
We have committees in every county and the state almost, we're very close, to tell this 250th anniversary story. And we've asked them to tell a more complete story. What advice would you give to those committees on trying to do that and including a diverse group and encouraging a diverse group to join their committees?
Wow. Well, essentially, first of all, as far as diversity goes in America at that time, of course it depends on your definition of diverse, whether you mean the different religious groups as well as ethnic groups, as well as racial groups and so forth, because there was only but so much diversity in America in those days, as we well know, because in the 1790s when they started the census, they were not interested in having other racial groups immigrate to America other than the forced immigration of Africans, you see. So you would have to look really, really hard for things like this. If you're, say, interested in the work of what black people did during those days, there are a couple of sources I would recommend. A good friend of mine, Dr. Bobby Donaldson at the University of South Carolina, he heads up their program in African American research over there, as well as the Avery Research Center down in Charleston is a great repository for this kind of information. Now, both the Richland County, Spartanburg, the Kennedy Room at the Spartanburg County Library, the South Carolina Room at the Charleston County Library, and I'm sure they have a similar one at the Richland County Library in particular. County libraries are great for archives, for local county history, so I would encourage people to use sources like that for that sort of information.
Didn't Marion release some slaves?
I would have to, okay, I know about Oscar. I don't know, I would have to look into that.
I read that he did release at least 2 or 3.
Okay, well, okay, I would very much like to know if he did, so I'd be more than happy to look into that.
Jeremy Nutt will be able to tell us right away.
Okay, working with Marion papers, you know, one of the disconnects that I found is actually the story about Oscar Marion. Because, okay, so Oscar's father ran Marion's plantation during the war or whatever, and it was a very close connection with the family. One of the early wills that he had provided things for Peggy, I believe, I think Peggy was Oscar's sister, if I'm not mistaken. And when it came to his end-of-life will, the fact that Oscar and the family members were not free was actually a surprise. And the only, you know, as you try to rationalize that, you know, you can either do the good, the bad, or the ugly. The laws at the time, I believe, were that if you manumitted a slave, that they had to, at that point, move, go somewhere else. So I'm wondering if that is a factor, and I'm asking because I don't really know.
No worries, sir. Here's the situation with that. Now, up until 1822, the slave owner had the right to manumit as they saw fit. Usually in cases when the slave person saved the owner's life or something like that, they were free to manumit them at will if they wish. Now, what happened to change that was the Denmark-Vesey Slave Rebellion of 1822 in Charleston, where Denmark-Vesey purchased his own freedom from his owner, Captain Joseph Vesey, and he tried to lead the unsuccessful slave rebellion of 1822, where he and his followers were executed. After that, the state of South Carolina made it illegal for the owner to manumit, but that's 1822, you see, so that's way after that. Now, you raise an important question in that, though, when you say that you try to rationalize this. You know, as a historian, I've come to the conclusion that it basically is what it is. These were people of their time. They did these things because, see, you know, when I came back from Africa, one of the things I came to understand about us as Americans as a people is that we have a tendency to think in terms of absolutes. And here's what I mean by that. When I try to explain to my friends about Africa, that Africa has great, majestic cities like Dakar and Accra and places like that, as well as huts and jungles and that sort of thing, they found it hard to put the two together. And I said, well, see, two things can be true at the same time. It's not an absolute. Now, how that relates to what you're talking about is this. Yes, Francis Marion did great things as far as the liberation of America. That is true, as well as did George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Yes, these men were slave owners with the attitudes of their time as others of their time. So basically, two things can be true at the same time. And that's kind of where I stand on that.
If I may comment on it, I agree with you, what you're saying. My name's Karen McNutt, and I've participated here for many years, and I wrote an article on Buddy. It was published in a...
On who?
On Oscar Marion.
Okay.
All right. It was published by the South Carolina Historical Society. I also was kind of taken aback because the relationship between Buddy, that was what Marion called Oscar, and Marion was very close apparently. And that's reflected in all the contemporary writings. Marion always spoke very highly of Buddy. And although in an earlier will he had freed 3 of his slaves at the time, that was a will that predated the Revolution. The will he wrote after he married Mary Esther did not free anybody. Now, 2 of the people who he had named his earlier will apparently had died. One was his nurse, Willoughby, and the other was June, who was the man who took care of his plantation during the war. The British seized all of his property and sold it all off. And apparently the only members of his slave community that survived were the ones survived in South Carolina as opposed to being sold off or being carried off, were some of the ladies that had gone to his brother's plantation at Belle Isle and were there and therefore didn't get caught in the net. And Buddy, who was with him, and 10 others who we were told hid out in the swamps to avoid being grabbed by the British. All I can come to is the same conclusion, and that is that if he had, my understanding of the slave law at the time was that Marion could free his slaves, but they would have to leave the state. And there was a long family interaction here between Buddy's family and the Marions, and they just, all I can say is I don't think that they wanted to be that separation. But again, it's guessing. And I know you're a specialist in this, and I would like to talk to you offline about it, but the only law I could find from 1755 or something like that basically made that provision. In any event, thank you very much for coming and speaking to us. It's a difficult topic, and I'm glad that you're involved with it. And I'm happy to speak with anyone what I determine and from what you're saying.
Let me say this about that. Number one, there are too many cases of people who were manumitted that didn't have to leave during that time period for that to be the case. But again, this is just simply accepting the fact that history is what it is, and that we cannot make mental gymnastics to twist them to 21st century standards. See, in other words, the only way we can learn from this history is accepting it as it really is. I don't really think that it's that difficult to understand that you can say, just the same way that many of us in this room, we love our parents, but we know good and well our parents were imperfect people, okay? We can share the good that the Francis Marions, the George Washingtons, the Thomas Jeffersons did and all of that, but still understand that these were men with feet of clay. Yes, they did things that weren't always good when it comes to enslavement and all of that. It's the duality that's just simply a reality that we in the 21st century can do only one thing about, and that's learn from it.
I want to commend Damon as well. He's done an excellent job. I also want to say that we are now researching and finding a lot more material about what he's talking about. I have a friend named Kevin Lofter as well. He's an author, and he has written a book called The Odyssey of John Cazell, similar to the other one that you just talked about with the British laws. And he was promised his freedom as a slave. Now, they don't have a complete story of it, that's why it's called The Odyssey. But he's telling the same thing. This guy was promised his freedom because he was a British a slave owner was a rich person. When they did say, go ahead, we will let you go since we lost the war to Nova Scotia. When he got to Nova Scotia, he found out that the Nova Scotian people treated him just as bad as when he was in enslavement. So he decided then, he stayed there as long as he could. It was cold weather and all, and he was able to work himself back to Sierra Leone, to Freetown. And from there, he was able to become an abolitionist as well. And he spoke to, he went to London, he spoke to England, he spoke to the king and stuff. He also spoke to slaves, to kings and stuff there in Africa, and told them this slavery that they have in America is not the slavery that we're thinking about here. So he told his story as well as he could. But these are researchers that are now recently coming out. But I like that Damon says, it's two sides of the stories, and that, not two sides of the story, but things that has to be told. And for our history to be complete, we must tell the whole story. And I thank goodness that you all are doing the research that you do today, and we are doing much better today in this. Thank you.
I'll be happy to take a couple more. Go right ahead.
Could you please elaborate a little more on James Lafayette? I know you know more than you told, but he took the last name of Marquis Lafayette because of his work to get him set free. But the whole story of his being a spy for the American defense, it was really an amazing story.
Well, actually, you know, that's something that goes through a lot of American history, because you see, a century after that, Harriet Tubman would do the same thing here in South Carolina. With, as a matter of fact, I was just in Beaufort last week speaking in regard to Robert Smalls, who I was telling you about a little bit earlier. And that's what Harriet Tubman did before the Combahee River Raid, was to go into the Confederate camps and pretend to be ignorant, and this ignorant slave woman. And so while she's cooking for them, they're telling her, they're talking about their plans, thinking that she's ignorant and doesn't know what's going on. And she would go right back to the Union with that information, would use that to free the people in that part of Beaufort County, over 700 to be exact. So James Lafayette was just basically doing an early version of that. He would go around Benedict Arnold and in the Loyalist camps and all of that, and do servant work and pretend to be illiterate, but pretend to be ignorant, excuse me, and soak up everything that he had heard and taking it back to the Patriots in order to use that against them. And so in his case, however, he was one of the black patriots who lived to see the fruit of his labor, and that he petitioned the Virginia government for his freedom after the war, and they said, look, you're fully deserving of this. So he was freed in 1787.
Thank you for your presentation. A friend of mine, John Reeves, has been writing essays on blacks, patriot and loyalists, for quite a few years. You can find him on Script. He's recently published 2 books on blacks during the American Revolution. One is They Were Good Soldiers, and that's available on Amazon. It specifically deals not with the politics, but with the history of the colonies, the attitudes, and the actual conduct of those men. Thank you.
Good. Thanks for letting me know that.
I wasn't supposed to say anything about this, but Damon also does impersonation.
No.
But anyway, let's give him a big hip hip.